The setup. Victoria Blackwood stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of her penthouse office, watching the Seattle skyline blur through sheets of October rain. At 34, she was the Chief Technology Officer of Quantum Systems, a position she'd earned through brilliant code and ruthless determination. But today, her mind wasn't on algorithms or profit margins. It was on the credit card statement lying open on her mahogany desk, a statement that would change everything. The charges were small, almost insignificant among the usual corporate expenses. A dinner at Le Bernardin for two when Harrison claimed he was in meetings all evening, jewelry from Tiffany that she'd never received, a weekend at the Ritz-Carlton during his supposed business trip to Portland. Each transaction was a tiny crack in the foundation of their 8-year marriage, but together they formed a chasm she could no longer ignore. Victoria had built her career on patterns, on seeing connections others missed. The same analytical mind that had revolutionized data encryption was now dissecting her husband's betrayal with surgical precision. She pulled up Harrison's credit report on her laptop, access she'd gained years ago when they'd first discussed joint finances. What she found made her stomach turn: hidden accounts, shell companies she'd never heard of, asset transfers moving millions out of their joint holdings into structures she couldn't trace. This wasn't just an affair, it was financial warfare, and she was the target. Her phone buzzed. A text from Harrison. "Working late again tonight? Don't wait up. Love you." Victoria almost laughed at the casual cruelty of it. She opened her laptop and began typing, her fingers flying across the keyboard with the same intensity she brought to debugging critical systems. If Harrison thought he could outmaneuver her in the digital realm, he'd forgotten who had taught him everything he knew about network security. She started with the basics: keystroke logging software discreetly installed on their home router. Then she moved to more sophisticated tools, packet sniffing programs to intercept his communications, GPS tracking through their shared family plan, even a simple but effective method of monitoring his browser history through their synced accounts. But Victoria knew she needed more than digital breadcrumbs. She needed irrefutable proof that would hold up in court and destroy any narrative Harrison might construct about her stability or fitness as a mother. She touched her barely visible baby bump, just 12 weeks along, a pregnancy Harrison had seemed thrilled about until recently. That evening, she played her part perfectly. When Harrison came home at nearly midnight, reeking of expensive perfume and lies, she greeted him with a sleepy smile and a kiss on the cheek. She asked about his day, listened to his fabricated stories about client meetings, and even rubbed his shoulders when he complained about stress. "You're working too hard," she murmured, her voice soft with feigned concern. "Maybe we should take a vacation after the baby comes." Harrison's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Maybe," he said, but she caught the slight tension in his shoulders, the way his gaze shifted away from hers. He was already planning their ending, while she was just beginning her counteroffensive. As he showered, Victoria quietly accessed his phone using the biometric bypass she'd discovered months earlier, a security flaw he'd arrogantly dismissed when she'd pointed it out. She installed a mirroring app that would send copies of all his communications to a secure server she'd established under a corporate account he'd never trace. The game had begun, and Victoria Blackwood was playing to win. Part 2. The Deception. Unveiled. Harrison Blackwood straightened his Italian silk tie and checked his reflection in the courthouse bathroom mirror. At 41, he still possessed the sharp-featured handsomeness that had first attracted investors to his tech startup 15 years ago. But today wasn't about charm or charisma. It was about careful orchestration of the truth. He'd spent months preparing for this moment, crafting a narrative so convincing that even he sometimes believed it. Victoria, His brilliant but increasingly unstable wife had become a liability to his empire. The pregnancy had made her paranoid, jealous, and financially reckless. At least that's what his lawyer would argue in court. Ready? Natasha Cross appeared beside him, her reflection joining his in the mirror. At 28, she was everything Victoria no longer seemed to be. Young, adoring, uncomplicated. Her emerald dress hugged her curves perfectly, a deliberate choice, designed to maximize impact. "Are you sure about this?" Harrison asked, though his tone suggested the decision was already made. "Bringing you into the courtroom is provocative." Natasha's smile was predatory. "That's exactly the point. We want to provoke her. The more unstable she appears, the stronger your case becomes." She adjusted his collar with practiced intimacy. "Besides, I've been planning this almost as long as you have." They entered the courtroom together, a united front that drew immediate attention. Harrison's lawyer, Robert Kane, a silver-haired predator who specialized in high-stakes divorces, nodded approvingly. Everything was proceeding according to plan. The Honorable Judge Patricia Romano entered, and Harrison felt a flicker of concern. Romano had a reputation for being unpredictable, immune to the usual tactics that worked on other judges. But Kane had assured him that the evidence was overwhelming. Victoria's spending patterns, her increasingly erratic behavior, her refusal to seek mental health treatment, it all painted a picture of a woman losing her grip on reality. "Your Honor," Kane began his opening statement with practiced eloquence, "we are here today because my client, Harrison Blackwood, finds himself in an impossible position. He loves his wife, but he can no longer enable her self-destructive behavior." Harrison played his role perfectly, looking pained but resolute as Kane detailed Victoria's supposed mental decline. The gambling debts she'd allegedly accumulated, the violent outbursts their housekeeper would testify to, the paranoid accusations about surveillance and conspiracy. "My client seeks only to protect his unborn child from an environment that has become toxic and unstable," Kane concluded. "He asks this court for temporary custody and asset protection until Mrs. Blackwood can receive the help she desperately needs." Harrison glanced at the empty chair where Victoria should have been sitting. Her absence was part of their strategy, evidence of her inability to face reality. Her lawyer had claimed pregnancy complications prevented her appearance, but Harrison knew better. Victoria was hiding, probably at her sister's house, probably drinking wine and planning some desperate last-minute defense. Natasha squeezed his hand under the table, and Harrison felt a surge of confidence. They had outmaneuvered Victoria completely. She might be brilliant with computers, but she was naive about people, about power, about the cold realities of legal warfare. The judge announced that Victoria would testify via video link, and Harrison almost laughed. This would be even better than he'd hoped. The jury would see a desperate woman appearing via webcam from some makeshift setup, probably looking disheveled and unstable. It would be the perfect capstone to his carefully constructed narrative. The screen flickered to life and Harrison's confident smile began to fade. The woman looking back at him wasn't the broken, desperate creature he'd expected. Victoria sat composed and professional in what appeared to be a proper conference room setup. Her pregnancy was obvious, but dignified, her expression calm and utterly controlled. For the first time since this began, Harrison Blackwood felt a flutter of genuine fear. This wasn't in the script. Victoria was supposed to be falling apart, not looking like she was about to conduct a board meeting. When she spoke, her voice carried the same quiet authority that had made her legendary in Silicon Valley. "Your Honor, I appreciate the opportunity to respond to these serious allegations against my character and fitness as a mother." Harrison's blood ran cold. Something had changed. The woman he thought he'd broken was looking at him through that. screen like a chess master who'd just moved her queen into position. And for the first time, Harrison began to suspect he might not be winning this game after all. The investigation judge Patricia Romano had presided over family court for 18 years, and in that time, she'd seen every conceivable form of human cruelty disguised as love. But something about the Blackwood case felt different from the moment she'd read the initial filings. The allegations were too neat, too convenient, and the timing too perfect. Now, looking at Victoria Blackwood's composed image on the courtroom screen, Romano's instincts were screaming that there was far more to this story than anyone had yet revealed. Mrs. Blackwood, Romano began, her voice carrying the authority of nearly 2 decades on the bench. You've heard some very serious allegations made against you today. Before we proceed, I want to be clear about something. This courtroom values truth above all else. Do you understand? Victoria's response was immediate and unwavering. Completely, Your Honor. Truth is exactly why I requested permission to present my testimony in this format. What I'm about to share requires visual aids that I believe will clarify the situation considerably. Romano raised an eyebrow. In her experience, desperate spouses rarely came this prepared. She glanced at Harrison Blackwood, whose confident demeanor was beginning to show cracks, and at the young woman beside him, whose presence alone spoke volumes about the family dynamics at play. Very well, please proceed. Victoria's presentation began not with defensive denials, but with a methodical deconstruction of the timeline leading to this moment. Romano watched, fascinated, as Victoria displayed financial records, communication, logs, and surveillance data with the precision of a forensic accountant. Your Honor, Victoria explained as a complex flowchart appeared on screen. 3 months ago, I discovered irregularities in our joint financial accounts. My husband, who built his career on transparency and ethical business practices, had created a labyrinth of shell companies and offshore accounts. Romano leaned forward. This was no longer about marital infidelity or custody disputes. Victoria was alleging systematic financial fraud, and the evidence she was presenting was disturbingly comprehensive. I am a software engineer by training, Victoria continued, and when I see patterns in data, I investigate them. What I discovered was not just an affair, but a coordinated campaign to transfer our marital assets beyond my reach while simultaneously building a legal case to have me declared mentally unfit. The judge glanced at Robert Kane, Harrison's lawyer, whose face had gone pale. Kane was frantically whispering to his client, clearly learning information he hadn't been privy to before this moment. Victoria displayed a series of recorded conversations, and Romano had to maintain her judicial composure as she listened to Harrison and Natasha discussing their project with chilling casualness. They spoke about Victoria like she was an obstacle to be removed, not a human being whose life they were systematically dismantling. Mrs. Blackwood, Romano interrupted, these recordings raise serious questions about consent and privacy laws. How do you justify this surveillance? Victoria's answer was legally sound and ethically devastating. Your Honor, under Washington state law, I had the right to record conversations in my own home, particularly when I had reasonable suspicion of criminal activity. What you're hearing is evidence of conspiracy to commit fraud, identity theft, and potentially extortion. Romano had seen enough divorces to know when civil proceedings were about to become criminal matters. The evidence Victoria was presenting suggested crimes that went far beyond marital misconduct. She could see Detective Marcus Chen in the gallery taking notes. Chen specialized in financial crimes and rarely appeared in family court unless federal agencies were already involved. The most damning evidence came last. Recorded conversations between Harrison and Natasha discussing not just the affair and asset hiding, but systematic fraud at Blackwood Industries. They had been inflating contracts, manipulating stock prices, and using Victoria's technical expertise, without her knowledge, to cover their tracks. "Your Honor," Victoria concluded, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she'd just revealed, "I'm not asking this court to punish my husband for his betrayal of our marriage. That's between us. But I am asking for protection from continued financial abuse and for the truth to be acknowledged before decisions are made about my fitness as a mother." Romano looked around the courtroom. Harrison Blackwood was no longer the sympathetic figure his lawyer had painted. He was a man whose entire public persona was crumbling in real time. Natasha Cross had gone from confident conspirator to terrified accomplice. And Victoria Blackwood had just transformed from victim to prosecutor. "Ladies and gentlemen," Romano announced, "I'm calling a recess. Mr. Kane, I suggest you have a very serious conversation with your client. Mrs. Blackwood, I'm ordering all evidence you've presented today to be preserved and forwarded to the appropriate authorities." As the gavel fell, Romano knew this case would define the remainder of her career. She'd just witnessed one of the most sophisticated cases of marital fraud she'd ever encountered, and the woman who'd solved it had done so while pregnant and supposedly suffering a mental breakdown. The truth, as Victoria had promised, was indeed clarifying everything. Part 4. The Evidence. Natasha Cross had built her entire adult life around being underestimated. At 28, she'd learned that her striking looks and carefully cultivated image of vapid ambition made people dismiss her intelligence, a mistake that had served her well in climbing from Harrison's executive assistant to his partner in both business and betrayal. But as she sat in that courthouse, watching Victoria methodically dismantle their carefully constructed narrative, Natasha realized she might have finally met someone who'd seen through her act from the beginning. The recess felt interminable. Harrison paced the small conference room like a caged animal, while his lawyer, Robert Kane, stared at documents as if they were written in a foreign language. Everything they'd planned, every carefully crafted lie, was unraveling faster than they could react. "Did you know?" Kane demanded, his usual composure shattered. "Did either of you know she was recording everything?" Harrison's laugh was bitter and sharp. "Victoria's a software engineer. Of course she was documenting things. I just never thought—" He trailed off, unable to finish the sentence that would admit his wife had outsmarted him completely. Natasha felt a cold knot forming in her stomach. She'd underestimated Victoria from their first meeting 2 years ago, dismissing her as a brilliant but socially awkward wife who posed no real threat to Natasha's plans. That miscalculation was about to cost her everything. When court resumed, Victoria continued her presentation with the methodical precision of someone who'd spent months preparing for this exact moment. She displayed financial records showing how Harrison had used Natasha's name on numerous shell company formations, making her a legal accomplice to fraud she'd helped orchestrate but never fully understood the scope of. "Your Honor," Victoria's voice carried across the courtroom, "Ms. Cross wasn't merely my husband's mistress. She was an active participant in corporate fraud. Her signatures appear on documents transferring company assets to private accounts. Her social security number was used to establish credit lines that funded their operation." Natasha watched in horror as evidence of her involvement flashed across the screen. Bank statements, loan applications, corporate filings, all bearing her information, all tying her inexorably to crimes she'd never intended to commit. Victoria had been thorough. She'd traced every financial transaction, every digital communication, every moment of physical surveillance. The woman Natasha had dismissed as a paranoid wife had actually been conducting a forensic investigation that would have impressed federal prosecutors. The recordings were the most devastating evidence. Natasha heard her own voice plotting Victoria's downfall, discussing strategies to make her appear mentally unstable, celebrating their success in isolating her from mutual friends and family. What had felt like intimate pillow talk between conspirators now sounded like the calculated cruelty of sociopaths. "We discussed having her committed," Natasha heard herself saying on one recording. "Harrison knows a psychiatrist who would testify to her instability for the right price." Judge Romano's expression grew colder with each revelation. This wasn't just divorce proceedings anymore. It was evidence of criminal conspiracy, fraud, and potentially bribery of medical professionals, but the most damaging evidence was yet to come. Victoria displayed communications between Natasha and several of Harrison's business associates, showing how she'd used her position to gather insider information for stock trades and contract manipulations. Natasha had thought she was playing sophisticated games, but Victoria had documented every illegal move. "Your Honor," Victoria continued, "Ms. Cross used her access to privileged information to manipulate Blackwood Industries' stock prices. She established investment accounts under assumed names and coordinated trades that netted her over $2 million in illegal profits." Harrison reached for her hand, but Natasha pulled away. She could see Detec. The reckoning. Detective Marcus Chen had worked financial crimes for 12 years, but he'd never encountered a case where the victim had done 90% of the investigative work before law enforcement was even aware a crime had occurred. As he reviewed Victoria Blackwood's evidence files, he found himself impressed by the thoroughness of her documentation and appalled by the scope of the fraud she'd uncovered. The Blackwood case had exploded beyond family court within hours of Victoria's testimony. Federal agents were now involved. The SEC had launched an investigation into Blackwood Industries, and the IRS was examining 7 years of tax returns for signs of systematic evasion. "She's got them dead to rights," Chen told his partner as they prepared arrest warrants. "Harrison Blackwood and Natasha Cross aren't just looking at divorce proceedings anymore. This is RICO territory. Organized criminal activity, wire fraud, securities violations, conspiracy. We're talking decades in federal prison." The beauty of Victoria's approach was its patience. While Harrison and Natasha had been executing their plan to destroy her, she'd been building an ironclad case that would destroy them. Every illegal transaction had been documented, every criminal conversation recorded, every lie exposed with digital precision. Chen had interviewed Victoria the morning after the courthouse drama. Sitting in her attorney's conference room, she'd been calm, professional, and utterly devastating in her recounting of events. She'd transformed from victim to prosecutor to star witness, and her testimony would anchor prosecutions that could span multiple jurisdictions. "Detective," she'd said, "I need you to understand something. This isn't about revenge. This is about justice. My husband and his accomplice tried to steal millions of dollars, destroy my reputation, and separate me from my child. They used the legal system as a weapon against me. That cannot be allowed to stand." The financial evidence was overwhelming. Harrison had moved over $8 million in marital assets through shell companies and offshore accounts. He'd used Blackwood Industries as his personal bank, inflating contracts and skimming profits. Natasha had been his willing accomplice, using insider information to manipulate stock trades and establish fraudulent investment accounts. But the criminal conspiracy went deeper. Victoria had uncovered evidence that Harrison had been bribing city officials for favorable zoning decisions, manipulating environmental impact studies, and using his political connections to secure government contracts through fraudulent bidding processes. The corruption touches at least 12 public officials and 3 federal contractors, Chen explained to the prosecutor. This case is going to reshape how we investigate white-collar crime. Victoria Blackwood didn't just catch her husband cheating, she uncovered a criminal enterprise. The arrests were swift and coordinated. Harrison was taken into custody at his office, surrounded by federal agents as his employees watched in shock. Natasha was arrested at the spa where she'd been hiding since the courthouse revelations, her perfect manicure ruined by handcuffs. The media coverage was relentless. Tech mogul's double life exposed by pregnant wife dominated headlines for weeks. Victoria became an unlikely hero, the brilliant woman who'd used her technical expertise to expose massive corruption while supposedly suffering a mental breakdown, but Chen knew the real story was more complex. Victoria hadn't been driven by heroism or even revenge. She'd been motivated by the cold, calculating desire to protect herself and her child from people who viewed them as obstacles to be eliminated. 6 months later, Chen testified at Harrison's federal trial. The man who'd once commanded corporate boardrooms and philanthropic galas sat broken and defeated as prosecutors detailed his crimes. Natasha had cooperated with authorities, her testimony sealing Harrison's fate in exchange for a reduced sentence. Victoria gave birth to a healthy daughter and returned to her position at Quantum Systems, where she was promoted to CEO after her former company's stock price tripled following news of her investigative skills. She'd turned her husband's betrayal into career advancement, single motherhood into strength, and victimhood into victory. She played a longer game than anyone realized, Chen reflected as he closed the case file. While they were planning her destruction, she was documenting theirs. In the end, the brilliant software engineer proved that the best revenge isn't getting mad, it's getting evidence. Harrison Blackwood was sentenced to 15 years in federal prison. His empire collapsed, his reputation destroyed by the wife he'd underestimated. Victoria Blackwood had won more than a divorce case. She'd authored one of the most sophisticated takedowns of corporate crime in recent memory, all while pretending to be the fragile victim of her husband's manipulation. The truth, as she'd promised the court, had indeed clarified everything.